Reed stalks snap beneath iron boots. Xin soldiers push into Heze marshlands, chasing smoke from burning tax ledgers. A state granary stands open, grain pouring into farmers' hands. Officials flee. The patrol halts at the water's edge, unable to advance. Then the commander appears, Zhao Ping, a woman renowned for expounding the classics. In this season of rebellion, noble titles mean nothing. Only two things matter: control of grain and control of belief. Lose either and the regime falls. The Xin Dynasty did not begin in chaos. It began in stability. In the year 9, Common Era Wang Mang took the throne with promises: restore ancient order, revive the moral purity of the Zhou dynasty, correct the failures of Han. He spoke of reform and claimed to protect the classics. He declared history stood on his side. But reform requires capacity. And capacity must be built, not merely proclaimed. Under the Wang Tian system, land was nationalized. Private fields were reorganized, redistributed, standardized. In theory, this would weaken powerful clans and protect the landless. In practice, administration lagged behind ambition. Property status on paper changed faster than officials could survey it. Some farmers lost the plots they had been working. Redistribution stalled. Local elites stripped of assets quietly resisted or sabotaged compliance. The foundation of rural society shifted, and no one knew where they stood. Simultaneously, the state tightened control over essentials. Salt, iron, alcohol, minted currency, forest products, wetland resources, all placed under centralized management. Revenue would stabilize the treasury. That was the plan. Instead, markets contracted, prices spiked, confidence eroded. Currency reforms came in rapid succession. Each new issue meant to restore order, but each change amplified confusion. Commerce slowed as people hesitated to accept what might soon become worthless. Then the river changed course. During Wang Mang's reign, the Yellow River shifted not once but twice. Floodwaters swept across the North China Plain. Houses dissolved into mud. Fields vanished beneath silt. People evacuated to higher ground in Hebei and Shandong. Entire communities rebuilt amid instability. The court continued issuing laws. Edicts piled up. Enforcement grew harsher. Collective punishment under mutual responsibility laws meant one accusation could destroy an entire household. Hebei and Shandong did not explode all at once. They simmered first. Authority weakened. Grain distribution became uneven. Local officials guarded granaries more carefully than they guarded villages. When smoke rose at Heze, collapse was not an accident. It was a system under strain, waiting for someone who understood that grain and legitimacy were the same problem. Pingyuan was not the cradle of political theory. It was a frontier of waterways and grain trade routes and storage depots, a corridor between Hebei and Shandong where boats mattered more than proclamations. But here Zhao Ping emerged. Official histories preserve only fragments. They note that she could expound the classics. The phrase is brief, almost casual. Yet in the intellectual world of the Han, that detail was decisive. The classics were not literature, they were authority. To interpret them was to interpret order itself. For a woman to occupy that position was an anomaly. Women of this period did not hold official scholarly positions. They did not lecture at court. They did not compile legal commentaries. Knowledge passed through male lineages, protected by rank and ritual. That Zhao Ping was recognized as capable of interpreting canonical texts suggests either rare education in a scholarly household or extraordinary self-cultivation. The sources do not clarify. What we know for certain is that her literacy became political capital. Rebellion without doctrine is seen as hunger. Rebellion with doctrine becomes accusation. Standing before displaced farmers and indebted tenants, she did not just speak of anger. She spoke of order betrayed. If Wang Mang claimed to restore antiquity, then the language of antiquity could be turned against him. The classics contained ideals of fair distribution, moral governance, restrained taxation. Interpreted carefully, they exposed the gap between promise and reality. This was not abstract argument. It was transference. She converted grievance into principle. That difference separated her from many contemporaries. Other uprisings in the late Xin period were driven by desperation and local feuds. Zhao Ping's movement had coherence. Her words shaped discontent. The farmers who followed her were not merely fleeing debt, they were participating in the restoration of order. Intellectual authority also solved a second problem: legitimacy in a patriarchal society. Commanding soldiers requires more than personal charisma. It requires justification. By positioning herself as an interpreter of moral law, rather than a seeker of personal power, she reframed leadership as duty. She was not claiming a throne. She was claiming alignment with principle. In times of stability, that argument might have been dismissed, but in times of systemic strain, it had force. The woman at Heze was not just distributing grain. She was redefining who had the right to define justice. If the classics gave Zhao Ping language, the game of Liubo gave her structure. Liubo was not mere entertainment. In the Han world, strategy games functioned as miniature battlefields. Pieces moved within defined constraints. Outcomes depended on probability, prediction, and sacrifice. To master such a game was to train the mind in sequencing consequences. Zhao Ping was known for her skill at Liubo. The detail seems trivial at first glance. It is not. Peasant uprisings were typically described as spontaneous eruptions, anger without planning, numbers without coordination. But movements that lasted longer than a season required pattern recognition. They needed someone who could see 2 moves ahead. In Liubo, a miscalculation could cost position. In war, it cost supply, morale, and territory. What distinguished Zhao Ping from a bandit leader was not aggression, it was calculation. She did not charge fortified centers. She selected weaknesses. She probed response times. She assessed how quickly local officials could mobilize forces, how far Xin troops would pursue, and where retreat routes narrowed or widened. Strategy is the art of choosing where not to fight. Her early moves reflected that discipline. Engagements were brief. Targets were chosen for leverage, not spectacle. Administrative sites, transport nodes, symbolic offices of power all struck in sequence. Each action was weighed against expected retaliation. This is where intellectual training and tactical thinking intersected. The classics taught moral reasoning. Liubo trained conditional thinking. Together they produced a leader who understood systems rather than moments. She grasped that the Xin Dynasty's weakness was not any single policy. It was overextension. Reforms had multiplied friction points. Each unpopular edict created local resentment. Each disrupted transaction slowed revenue flow. A centralized state depends on timing and coordination. If either breaks down, confidence fractures. Zhao Ping's approach did not aim for immediate overthrow. It aimed for imbalance. In a game, weakening an opponent's structure forces them to react. In politics, forcing the court to respond costs initiative. Each time Xin forces redeployed to contain unrest, they admitted control was not complete. This is the cold logic of insurgency: make the stronger side act first and act often. When her reputation spread beyond Pingyuan, it carried a different meaning. She was not a random phenomenon caused by famine. She was an organizer, someone who treated rebellion as a sequence, not an explosion. The board was larger than Heze, and she was already thinking past the next square. Autumn year 21, Common Era. The movement came into focus. Heze was not the capital. It was a gathering point for displaced farmers, unpaid laborers, families in debt for taxes. Familiar grievances, unresolved, land disputes, taxes still collected despite failed harvests, punishment extended through mutual responsibility laws. Pressure had been building for years. What changed was coordination. Zhao Ping did not start with a mighty army. She started with several thousand people. The number mattered. Large enough to overwhelm a local office, small enough to move quickly. First targets: administrative centers. County halls attacked. Tax ledgers burned. The destruction was purposeful. Records were evidence of obligation. Erase them, and debt lost its proof. Prisons were broken open. Those held under collective punishment walked into daylight. Many did not go home. They joined. Granaries were opened. Grain was distributed, not hoarded. This was relief and recruitment simultaneously. Hunger converts sympathy to loyalty faster than any speech. The early phase of rebellion followed a pattern: strike, disperse, regroup. Xin forces sent to restore order typically arrived after events concluded, facing ash and empty storehouses. Pursuit was uneven. Local officials, uncertain of reinforcements, hesitated to engage deeply. A regional disturbance was taking shape. What differentiated this uprising from scattered riots was discipline in messaging. Actions were consistent with stated purpose. Destroying tax archives was not random vandalism, it symbolized cancellation. Targeting corrupt officials signaled accountability. Violence, when used, remained instrumental. Each successful campaign expanded participation. Farmers from neighboring counties streamed toward Pingyuan. News spread via river routes and trade channels. Authority appears stable until visibly violated. Once violated, calculations shift. By winter, what began as localized resistance had become organized structure. The Xin Dynasty still possessed superior manpower and formal command structure. But local power had shifted. In some Pingyuan counties, officials operated defensively, protecting granaries and compounds rather than enforcing new edicts. Zhao Ping did not declare a new regime. She did something more disruptive. She created zones where imperial order no longer functioned smoothly. Rebellion did not need to win immediately. It needed to persist. By year's end, persistence was no longer hypothetical. Once endurance was established, objectives became clearer. Across Pingyuan, Zhao Ping's forces shifted from disruption to restructuring. County halls were not just attacked, they were neutralized. Tax ledgers were carried into courtyards and burned before villagers. Debt recorded in ink vanished in smoke. The action was theatrical, but consequences were concrete. Without documentation, enforcement stalled. Treasuries were seized. Money taken from local vaults did not flow upward to the Xin Dynasty. It circulated outward, buying food, redistributing tools, supplying fighters. State currency became rebellion's instrument. Prisons were opened systematically. Those detained under collective punishment, relatives punished for others' alleged crimes, were released. Many became loyal recruits. The message was clear: rebellion opposed not just taxation, but the architecture of fear. Fortified estates belonging to powerful clans were next. These families functioned as local extensions of imperial authority, stabilizing policy through land control and private retainers. Attacking them weakened the link between court edicts and village compliance. This was when observers began assigning her actions a story. A woman burning tax offices, redistributing grain, punishing corrupt officials, she gained a reputation like a female Robin Hood. The label oversimplified what was essentially systematic intervention. She was not merely redistributing wealth, she was dismantling enforcement mechanisms. Each action followed sequence. Destroy records. Seize resources. Free prisoners. Weaken elites. Recruitment happened not through proclamation but through demonstrative action. Participation brought tangible relief. Crucially, the movement did not devolve into uncontrolled looting. Discipline distinguished insurrection from banditry. Targets were selected for strategic value. Indiscriminate violence would alienate the very people they depended on. By early the following year, multiple Pingyuan counties operated under diminished imperial oversight. Local officials petitioned for help. Reports described organized bands, not scattered thieves. The Xin Dynasty now faced a different equation. Suppression required troop allocation. Troop allocation required drawing forces from other unstable fronts. Zhao Ping's campaign had evolved from symbolic protest to parallel power structure. She demonstrated that legitimacy could be rebuilt from below, through grain, through protection, through visible reversal of injustice. Rebellion was no longer mere reaction. It had become program. Territorial control was temporary. Supply control was decisive. Pingyuan was not just a restive county. It was a critical logistics node. Grain transported along waterways, connecting Hebei and Shandong to the interior. Warehouses along these routes stabilized urban consumption, including shipments to the capital at Chang'an. The Xin Dynasty depended on predictable flow. Zhao Ping understood that strikes embarrassed officials. Controlling grain troubled the court. Her forces began positioning along arterial routes. Warehouses were occupied, not simply emptied. River crossings were monitored. Tax-bearing grain barges were intercepted or diverted. What had been sporadic seizure became managed operation. This marked transition from uprising to governance. Captured grain was catalogued and distributed purposefully. Fighting forces received supply priority to maintain operational capacity. Surplus fed surrounding communities, cementing loyalty. Support became reciprocal. Villagers provided intelligence, shelter, and manpower. In war, supply lines determine survival. A fed army fights. A starving army dissolves. For the Xin Dynasty, this disruption cascaded. Shipments reaching central warehouses declined. Local garrison units protecting grain depots came under pressure without reliable reinforcement. Merchants hesitated to transport goods through contested zones, further slowing circulation. Importantly, this was not achieved through major battles. It was achieved through strategic positioning. Controlling choke points forced imperial convoys onto longer, riskier routes. Each detour increased cost and vulnerability. The movement also scaled accordingly. From several thousand initially, it now coordinated across multiple counties. Communication relied on existing commercial networks, boatmen, market brokers, mobile labor leveraged as informants and messengers. Here, earlier intellectual discipline showed. Logistics requires foresight. Consumption rates must be predicted. Warehouses must be defended. Distribution must be timed correctly. By mid-year, the Pingyuan uprising had become self-sustaining without immediate plunder. That autonomy changed perception. This was no longer desperate outbreak. It was organized structure capable of maintaining power. The Xin Dynasty still maintained regular armies. But armies march on food. And in the north, food was increasingly managed by someone else. Zhao Ping had identified power's pivot point. Not ritual, not proclamation, provision. When supply grows scarce, confidence declines with it. And once confidence fractures, it is difficult to restore. Summer year, 22 Common Era. The local rebellion reached its structural limit. Holding Pingyuan required enormous manpower. Defending granaries, monitoring river routes, maintaining pressure on administrative centers, each task consumed fighters. A regional force could cause disruption. It could not withstand indefinite, concentrated imperial force. Zhao Ping made a strategic decision alliance. Xu Yiqing led another armed movement operating within the broader instability of the late Xin. Separately, both forces posed challenges. Combined, they changed scale. Negotiation was not symbolic unity, it was operational merger. Command structures were coordinated. Spheres of influence were demarcated. Intelligence was shared. The result was striking. Combined forces reached 100,000 people. That number changed classification. What the court had considered bandit groups was now viewed as an actual army. With increased numbers came new capabilities, sieges, defensive perimeters, coordinated strikes across counties, rather than isolated hits. Scale also brought risk. Larger forces required proportional supply. Grain reserves had to stretch further. Discipline had to tighten. Command cohesion became critical. Fragmentation would be catastrophic. For the Xin Dynasty, the consequence was immediate. An uprising of thousands could be suppressed by provincial response. An organized force of 100,000 demanded central attention. Soldiers previously assigned to border defense or other rebellions now required reconsideration. The conflict was no longer peripheral. It had become strategic. Yet this alliance was not merely about numbers. It represented the consolidation of grievances into structure. Multiple streams of rural resistance converged under coordinated leadership. Inter-county communication improved. Mobility increased through shared routes. The court's dilemma deepened. Concentrate forces in the north, other regions might erupt. Neglect the north, supply disruption would intensify. Zhao Ping had brought rebellion to a new phase. It was no longer about a county's survival, it was about control over the dynasty's ability to govern. In insurrection, growth must precede confrontation. She ensured that when confrontation came, it would not be organizationally asymmetric. The stakes had expanded. So had the risks. The Xin now fought on multiple fronts. In the south, the Lulin forces applied pressure. In the east, the Chime rebels attacked. In the north, the alliance under Zhao Ping and Xu Yiqing controlled territory stretching across Pingyuan and beyond. What had been isolated disturbances converged into patterned coordinated instability. For Wang Mang, the problem was arithmetic. Soldiers stationed along borders could not simultaneously protect the capital and suppress uprisings without reallocation. Reallocation weakened borders. Delay strengthened rebels. Each deployment carried opportunity cost. The court responded by dispatching generals, including Wang Quang and Lian Dan, to address the northern threat. Orders transmitted from Chang'an. Armies assembled. Supply trains followed. But strategic pressure does not necessarily require decisive battle. It requires sustained obligation. The Northern Alliance forced imperial units into continuous engagement, protecting transport routes, reinforcing vulnerable counties, retaking administrative centers only to defend them again. Offensive momentum broke. Initiative shifted to those choosing when and where disruption occurred. Meanwhile, grain shortage intensified along contested transport corridors. Convoys required heavier escort. Escort slowed movement. Slow movement increased attack risk. A dynasty demonstrates stability when it moves freely through its territory. When movement becomes contingent on negotiation, power weakens. The Xin Dynasty still retained formal advantages, ranked officials, standardized command systems, state resources. But those advantages eroded under multi-front pressure. Communication between theaters lagged. Reinforcements arrived late. Local commanders acted cautiously, aware that failure would have cascading consequences. Zhao Ping's role in this structure was not directly conquering Chang'an. It was anchoring the northern pressure axis. By controlling space and supply in Hebei and Shandong, her alliance prevented power concentration elsewhere. If the south pressed and the east destabilized, the north ensured nowhere could concentrate forces safely. This is the law of systemic collapse. Fragmentation precedes fall. By the time the court fully recognized the scale of organized rebellion, containment required more troops than central authority could effectively deploy. Confidence within the capital weakened. Reports from provinces carried urgency rather than reassurance. The Xin Dynasty had not yet collapsed, but they no longer operated from strength. When Wang Mang received reports that a woman was leading armed uprisings, the response was not merely military. It was cosmological. The Xin Dynasty had justified itself through restoring order. Order reinstated, hierarchy clarified, ritual stabilized. Within that framework, power distributed according to certain rules: ruler over subject, father over son, husband over wife. A woman commanding armies did not just disrupt logistics, it disrupted narrative. Court language shifted. Rebel leaders like Zhao Ping were labeled Daozi bandits, criminals, disturbers of public order. Some documents called them walking corpses, as if their challenge had expelled them from proper society. Language became weapon. Strip a movement's moral vocabulary, and it becomes lawless rather than reformist. This was communication strategy. If rural populations believed rebellion represented justice, recruitment would increase. If they believed it represented chaos, support might waver. By downgrading Zhao Ping to criminal status, the court attempted to contain symbolic spread. But labels could not erase visible fact. Farmers in Hebei and Shandong witnessed grain distribution. They witnessed burned tax ledgers. They witnessed local officials retreating. The contradiction between lived experience and official description grew stark. There was also the problem of precedent. Earlier, Lu Mu had rebelled. Now Zhao Ping led on larger scale. Multiple female leaders emerging in a short period amid crisis shook assumptions about stability. For a regime built on reviving classical order, such developments carried ominous implications. Sources suggest Wang Mang viewed these uprisings as signs of cosmic imbalance. Whether understood literally or politically, the message was clear. The regime saw this moment as aberrant. Psychological strain compounded material strain. As imperial forces redeployed and edicts issued, doubt spread through officialdom. If women could mobilize tens of thousands, what did that suggest about male loyalty? If counties could be occupied, were provincial capitals safe? Fear worked both directions. Rebels feared annihilation. Regimes feared obsolescence. Zhao Ping's significance at this stage exceeded battlefield metrics. She embodied a visible rupture in predicted order. Her presence undermined the argument that rebellion was marginal and certain to fail. In times of crisis, misperception can accelerate collapse. By year 23, Common Era pressure converged from multiple directions. The capital itself would soon face assault. The dynasty had begun in certainty. It now moved in doubt. Year 23, Common Era. The convergence reached terminus. Rebel armies advanced on Chang'an. Xin defenses already weakened after months of territorial reallocation, and successive engagements faltered. Wang Mang was killed. The regime he had built through reform and edict collapsed in violence. Dynastic collapse left no detailed record of all contributors. Zhao Ping's individual fate was not clearly documented. Surviving sources do not describe whether she died in battle, retired, or joined the emerging political order. The silence is notable. A leader who had anchored the northern front of rebellion became fragments. What remained were citations embedded in larger narratives, mentions in the Book of Han and Book of Later Han. She appeared as contextual element, not central figure. As disturbance factor, not architect. This was not accidental. Official historiography of the subsequent period had priorities: restore legitimacy, stabilize succession, affirm moral order. A female commander leading large-scale rural resistance complicated that story. Foregrounding her meant acknowledging that power had fractured from below in unexpected ways. Instead, classification performed erasure. By categorizing her among bandits, chroniclers reduced structural challenge to criminal case. By avoiding dedicated biography, they denied narrative continuity. Memory was compressed, yet structural impact persisted. Her campaign in Pingyuan and across Hebei Shandong contributed to dispersing Xin military capacity. Her control of grain transport corridors intensified pressure on central supply. Her alliance building converted local instability into organized force. She did not seize the throne. She did not establish a dynasty, but she operated at scale sufficient to force imperial recalculation. The dynasty she opposed collapsed. Subsequent chronicles narrowed her scope, but disappearance in documentation does not mean disappearance in consequence. The record of Zhao Ping moves through fragments. In the Book of Han, she appears within broader context of Wang Mang's final years, a northern rebel force. In the Book of Later Han, the label narrows bandit. The term performs administrative function. It ends argument. From there, comparison consumes her. Lu Mu is recalled as an earlier female insurgent, someone who initiated rebellion from personal grievance. Her story is drawn more sharply because it fits limited framing: maternal rage, local revenge, contained scale. In contrast, Zhao Ping's movement carried ideological articulation and strategic coordination. That complexity created more instability. Over time, comparison softened her edges. She became one example among many disturbances during the Xin collapse. Without dedicated biography, later generations inherited only references. Context overwhelmed character. This was not uncommon in dynastic historiography. Official histories prioritized regime continuity. Rebellions were viewed as interruptions requiring explanation, not alternative systems requiring examination. Yet fragments permit reconstruction of overall shape. A woman in Pingyuan, educated in classics, organized hundreds of thousands into disciplined force. A strategist applying calculated disruption tactics. An alliance reaching 100,000 that forced the court to acknowledge civil war. A northern pressure axis contributing significantly to regime weakening. She had no royal lineage to defend her reputation. No court faction to sponsor her story. No successor regime claiming her as founder. Her tools were limited knowledge, supply control, and credibility among dispossessed rural poor, and for a critical interval that was sufficient to alter imperial power distribution. Legacy does not always lie in monuments. Sometimes it lies in constraints, the degree to which a regime was forced to loosen limits. Zhao Ping's story is compressed in archives but expansive in meaning. She did not inherit power. She constructed it. She did not issue edicts. She redirected grain distribution. She did not sit on thrones. She destabilized one. If history called her bandit, the surviving evidence poses a different question. When a leader combines doctrine, logistics, and mass popular support to weaken a dynasty, what is the accurate term? The answer depends on who writes the record. Power decides not only who rules, but who gets called strategist versus who gets called thief. The categories we inherit reflect old victories, not eternal truth. If we look at structure rather than labels, Zhao Ping's outline becomes clear, a woman who understood that in times of collapse, control of grain and control of narrative are the same thing. A leader who proved that legitimacy can be rebuilt from below when the center fails its obligations. A strategist who identified the empire's pivot point and applied pressure until it shifted. The Jin fell. The archives compressed her role. But compression is not elimination. The question is not whether she wore a crown. The question is whether she identified power's axis and moved it. Zhao Ping did. And for one critical moment at the end of the Xin Dynasty, that was enough. If history called her a bandit, are we willing to call her a strategist?